Hello and welcome to this Anti-Sicilians DVD Volume 1, on which we're going to be looking at two of White's most important anti-Sicilian systems. Now the first of these will be a possible frequent visitor to the club players board, and I'm talking about the line with 2C3. This idea has a very compelling and easy quality to it, in that White's just threatening to grab the centre with D4, leaving Black slightly short of space in that sector. It's an idea which goes in and out of Sicilian fashion at the top level, but which remains incredibly popular at club level, and you have to know how to face it. I think one of the easiest systems that Black can play against 2C3 is the push in the centre D5. When White takes, yes, Black does bring his queen into the game early, which to a degree confronts the rules of opening play, if you like. But the queen can often be very well placed in the centre at the start of the game, as long as the opponent can't drive it out of the centre and gain time as a result. And precisely because of this move C3, White can't play knight C3, budging that black queen from her dominant central position. So I think the queen is quite good on D5 in this current position. If there is a drawback to C3, it's got to be that it's rather slow. White's idea takes a little bit of time to come into focus. For instance, after D4, knight F6, already Black has developed two pieces and White hasn't developed a single piece yet. So one of the things I like about this current Black position is that Black is getting ahead in development, and with the key move of the system, bishop G4, he goes even further ahead in development, and he also pins the knight on F3. This is one of the best ways to play against C3. It's the line I'm going to recommend to you now. It's easy to play and remember, and it's quite a coherent system. I suppose left to his own devices, Black's just going to play E6, bishop E7, knight C6, castles, and bring his rooks to the middle, followed by pressure on D4. I'm not sure what could be easier than that as a game plan. Well, now we come to the first game, played in the Istanbul Open in August 2010, between two Turkish players, Mortaza Darbanvigiani, who's graded 2344, so a player of master quality, and Baris Mehmet, playing with the black pieces. And in this game, White just simply played bishop e2, as a lot of your opponents are going to do. What could be simpler than that? Just breaking the pin. Well, Black just plays e6. And now he's preparing to bring his bishop on f8 into the game. It couldn't really be simpler. Well, White played h3 in this game, and there's no reason for Black to see the bishop pair at this early stage, so Baris Mehmet played bishop h5. And White played his bishop to e3. Okay, well this is the first critical moment in the game really, because White seems to be putting a little bit of pressure on the c5 pawn. Now clearly if you don't like this pressure, you could take on d4 straight away. And if White takes back with the pawn, Black can play bishop b4 check, continuing to get his pieces out. Well, here we see that Black does have a little bit of pressure here. I mean, this is a perfectly decent way to go for Black. But more interestingly in this game, Baris Mehmet played knight to c6, offering White the chance to grab on c5. And it's a chance White took. He took on c5. Now this must be seen as a temporary pawn sacrifice by Black. So with the queens apparently coming off, what is Black up to? I should stress that a lot of players haven't taken on c5 in this position because they understand Black does get compensation after that move, preferring to castle. When once again Black has the intriguing idea of taking on d4 and going bishop b4. As Garry Kasparov once played against the very strong computer Deep Blue. We're actually going to see that game next. Black's idea is that after knight c3 he goes queen a5, and there's a bit of pressure on c3 that White has to deal with. As you can see in this position, Black's development hasn't been interrupted in any way, and he's probably just going to castle and put his rooks on d8 and c8. Well, if there's an easier way to get a decent position than this against the C3 Sicilian, you'll have to tell me what it is, because I don't know of one. There are many complicated ways that Black can play in, but this is nice and easy. Moreover, White's got an isolated d pawn, and Black can plan to put pressure on that pawn. So, going back to the game, white decides to take on c5. The queens come off, and now black plays knight to d5. Well, that move sets up the simple threat of knight takes e3, followed by bishop takes c5. So, naturally, Darban Viagani took action against that with bishop d4. Now, if I was white in this position, I would be taking a very serious look at b4. This position reminds me very much of lines of the Queen's Gambit, perhaps the Slav, where black gets the chance to take on c4 early, and white doesn't really make any attempt to get the pawn back straight away. There, black is able to protect his pawn. So this seems quite similar to me. I mean, it must be that unless black can get that pawn back fairly quickly, or get demonstrable compensation for the pawn, white's queenside pawn majority is starting to look very dangerous. He's got an extra pawn there. Well, he's got two extra pawns, if you like, but an extra pawn in material terms. And where is black's compensation? Well, black obviously has plenty of choices here. I mean, he can play simplistically. He can take off the bishop. That's one way to play. But if black plays like this, he better have a clear idea where he's going. He has to make very, very good use of his dark squared bishop in this position, because that's the piece white doesn't have. At the moment, I don't see that the capture on e3 is right. You know, black doesn't have enough compensation for the pawn in this position. That capture can wait. Now, I think going back to the position after b4, black has two superior moves. I think jabbing at the pawns with a5 is one such move, because that forces white to move forward. If white goes a3, black can simply take on b4 twice, and the pawn on a3 will be pinned. So b5, and you can see the further these pawns come forward, the weaker they become. Now black takes on e3, having forced a weakening, and back comes the knight to e7. And now I think black is threatening to intensify the pressure with moves like knight d5 and knight f5. It's not so easy for white to hold his extra pawn in this position, and once the pawn goes, then I think black's dark square bishop could really come into its own. So perhaps c4, and now bishop g6 by black, followed by the transfer of the knight to f5. Suddenly, white is under pressure. Okay, perhaps this wasn't a forced variation, but it gives you an idea of how black works up play in this line. Going back to b4, another perhaps slightly more risky move here is to castle. Well, if white castles, then I think bishop e7 and then bishop f6 puts the pressure on white. Black's threatening to take on c3, getting his pawn back. I think I slightly prefer a5 to this line, but there's no doubt about it, castles is definitely another viable option. Well, in the game, white didn't want to think about such complications, played his bishop to d4, but I think this is possibly a misjudgment, and after f6, white is starting to get into trouble. Now black's idea is simply to go e5, and once he plays e5, he chops off that dark square bishop and he chops off on c5. He's going to be immediately better. He'll have a monster dark square bishop, and he will also have the much better pawn structure. White castles. Black castles on the queen side, and now white plays g4. Well, I don't like that move, but I think white was clearly getting very worried about this very simple idea of going e5. He couldn't see a way to nullify black's pressure. And perhaps that's the slightly surprising pressure that black is getting in this position. It's as a direct result of white ceding the centre with d takes c5. Yes, white gains a pawn. Only temporarily, it would seem. But he uncoordinates his position. He makes it difficult to get the rest of his pieces out by so doing. g4, was that forced? Well, it's certainly a move which can only give white headaches as the game progresses. And as we'll see, black manages to turn his attention to the white king here. And he starts off with the move e5. Well, bishop takes e5, that was white's point. Black took on e5. White took back. Well, I mean, obviously, white can take on h5. Black can then choose between taking on f3 and then taking on c5, or maybe taking on c5 straight away. Either way, I don't really like white's game. His pawn structure is extremely ragged, and black has got his pawn back. But after knight takes e5, black played a very superior move here, bishop e8, retaining the integrity of his pawn structure and keeping his two bishops to attack the poor white king. So white's still a pawn up in this position, but he has serious problems on the dark squares. Sometimes in chess, all that's needed to evaluate a position is to look around at the imbalances in the position. I see black's two bishops here, and in particular, I note the great potential of the dark square bishop. That's the piece white can't oppose. So it seems logical for black to occupy and dominate the dark squares, and with knight f4, that's exactly what he's doing. Well, white is really in trouble here. He tries to save himself by lurching forward on the king side, but black's raking bishops is now really starting to put the pressure on. King h2 was answered by bishop c7. The inevitable pressure on the dark squares increases. c4 was played, hoping perhaps to buy black off. Black can obviously play a move like knight d3 check and then take on b4, but quite correctly, I think, Baris Mehmet is after bigger fare here, and he plays b6 and then bishop b7, retaining his attack on the white king. After bishop c2, black played h5, threatening to bring all his pieces into the game. Once black gets the rook into the game on h8 against the white king, well, I think the attack would be decisive. So white has to continue to move forward, but of course, with every pawn advance, his position is becoming weaker and weaker. Now Baris Mehmet sees the right time to hit hard, and he does so with knight e2 check, and then rook hf8. All of black's pieces are now participating in the game, in the attack, and it's noticeable that white's rooks are doing absolutely nothing. This is why this position adds up to a very comfortable win for black. White simply can't defend himself against the combined onslaught of black's pieces. Moreover, white's minor pieces are very clumsy. Bishop d1 was very clumsy as well, and it was answered by knight c3. And in this position, white had enough. His minor pieces are just tripping over each other's toes. They can't defend each other easily, and white's king is just getting ready to be ripped apart. Black's simple threat is knight takes d1, winning a piece. And white couldn't see anything against that, so he decided to resign. So a good and inspiring way to start our investigation. Not all games with bishop g4 are going to go as well as that, but that was a recent example of the move where things went extremely well for black.